Hi everyone, my name is Andrew and today I'm with Dr. Andrew Feenberg from Fraser University in Vancouver. His field of study is in the philosophy of technology, science and technology studies, the critique of technology, critical theory, and post-development theory. Today we will be discussing these fields, his works in them, and how all of this relates to current world affairs. I'm very happy to be speaking with you again, and thanks for being here. The last time we spoke, we were discussing a bit the lockdown, but now things have changed a little bit. So how are things going in Vancouver?
I think it's one of the better cases of dealing with COVID-19 in the world, but not one of the best. Certainly a little better than the people to the south of us. But there still are several hundred cases a day in British Columbia. So it's not over. But there's a lot of activity in the public areas of the city. Just stores and restaurants are closed, so there's not much to do outdoors.
And have you started any new hobbies, or how have you been spending your time now inside?
Was before this started, I was writing a short book on Marcuse. I studied with him many years ago, and I've written some essays about him, and I thought I would try and put it together. And this has kept me pretty busy. I have time. There's nothing else to do. So I keep working on it, and it gradually improves. But it's an awful lot of time spent on a very short book.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about the theme of the book, what your aims are?
Well, Marcuse is a kind of ambiguous figure. I don't know if you remember exactly who he is. He was the most famous philosopher in the world in the late 1960s. The New Left picked him up, and he became a celebrity. And he supported the New Left. He was an activist philosopher in his old age. This resulted in him becoming more or less forgotten once the New Left left the scene. So some people have been trying to revive interest in his thought. I studied with him, so I know a lot about him and his works. And I'm trying to interest people in him also. And what I find most intriguing is some philosophical arguments that he takes for granted implicitly, but doesn't make explicit. And these are arguments that stem from his early studies with Husserl and Heidegger, the founders of phenomenology in the 1920s and early 30s. And it's kind of mysterious how these influences persist, even though he rejected Heidegger because Heidegger became a Nazi and disgraced himself, according to him. I think Marcuse was right. I think that he betrayed philosophy and disgraced himself by joining this movement. And yet, the influence is still there, and it's sort of subterranean, and that's what I'm trying to bring out.
It sounds really fascinating. I remember Elul wrote about the main ideas set forth by the Third Reich were so advanced and encapsulating that even though the Third Reich ended and Hitler died, as Hitler said, what I've accomplished will already take over the world. The set of the technological approach I've given to the world between the state and policy and yada yada yada. But maybe what do you think? What do you think of that statement for today's terms?
Well, that seems ridiculous to me.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, um, the Hitler did not do anything constructive of any interest that I'm aware of. So, and certainly the mobilization of technology for political ends was not unique to uh, Germany. Roosevelt did the same thing in the United States as soon as the U.S. entered the war. So it was simply a possibility of the modern state that was exploited by all states, the Soviets, everyone, as soon as they entered an emergency situation. Today, in fact, what's weird is that we, in the United States, we have a government that refuses to do this in the midst of an emergency. That's truly strange. Nobody, I think, can really understand what it means that the American state is so impotent in the face of this crisis.
So do you think there's sort of a rejection of technology and science for the, well, in the US, for people to have, let's say, their liberty comes first before how science can help them in science mixing with the state?
There's a minority of people who belong to a cult, and the lemonade master is Donald Trump. He has them all drinking it's the Kool-Aid, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, the Kool-Aid.
So, but I think this is a minority of the population. Polls seem to show that a large majority follows the science as best they can and tries to stay safe. So Trump has not actually succeeded in corrupting everybody's minds.
Well, besides this sort of phenomenon, and going back to the Nazis weren't the first to use technology as a way to, what would the word be, I guess, manifest certain state control. In more general terms, can you talk about the centralization of technology in the state and perhaps in the private sector, and sort of give us some information in your opinion on that?
Well, capitalism is a system under which private parties control public resources. Every big factory is a public entity that affects the life of a whole community. So we've entrusted a very large part of the public resources to private ownership, and the private owners are to some extent controlled and oriented toward public needs by the market. And the system, it works, sort of, not perfect, but the problem with it, as Marcuse argued, is not so much that it is a hopelessly bad mess, because it's not. It's pretty orderly and effective. It's that we are so rich that we could do much better. And the way the system is organized blocks progress toward a better organization of society, in which public resources are controlled by the public rather than by private parties. So the fact that private parties have this power does not mean that they are exempt from government action. There's regulation, which tries to prevent the worst abuses, and in crises there can be nationalization or direct control. There's a law in the United States, for example, which gives the government the power to direct those resources toward public ends in a crisis. So there's a kind of, it's not absolute. There's a kind of blurred boundary between public and private in modern capitalism. And that's in itself, I think that's necessary, that's essential. Had that boundary not been blurred, the capitalist system would not have survived. But capitalists adapted to pressures on them from struggles by unions and progressive political parties and social movements, and so we end up with this mixed system.
So I know a big concept or a big field of yours is the democratization of technology. And so when you're looking at private institutions mixing with government institutions, sort of for the democratization of technology, as you best see coming to fruition, is it less regulation, more regulation, or how does that manifest itself?
Well, certainly more regulation would make sense, but the level of the problem is not just at it's not just at the interaction of the state with the corporations. There's a deeper level of the problem, which is design, actual technological design. And here we have a peculiar situation. For a very long time, the public was not able to influence design. Capitalists in the 19th century were free to design technology without interference from the public. And they had a number of different problems they needed to solve with their technologies. On the one hand, they had to keep up with the competition, but on the other hand, they had to control the labor force. And controlling the labor force meant designing technologies that de-skilled workers allowed skilled workers to be replaced by unskilled workers, by essentially women and children. Competition in the market meant that they had to take whatever shortcuts they could to lower production costs, not only by cheapening labor, but also by exploiting the environment. So you end up with a technology that for over 100 years was developed under very strong pressures to make work painful, boring, and dangerous, and to pollute the environment to the maximum. I mean, I remember actually in the 1950s, I had an old copy of Fortune magazine, and I remember reading in it an article which declared that the United States was fortunate in having so many rivers to carry away the waste products of industry. So that was the mentality. Now, obviously, that's long gone, but it's a very slow and difficult process, undoing the heritage of bad technological designs. It challenges people's imagination. It challenges concepts of rights, because, of course, owners of business have rights, and interference in their activities is often resisted. So it's a tough and complicated process, and this is the process I think of as democratization of technology.
Well, typically people, when they think of the philosophy of technology, they think of the analytic side of things, how to understand how fast a computer can process, understanding how big data works, and you can infer information. But there's this whole other side of the sociological aspect. And what can you say are some of the important things the general public, sort of common knowledge, should be about the philosophy of technology in the more societal aspect?
The single most important thing that the public should know is that technological design is not determined by scientific principles. Scientific principles are certainly a factor in design, but only one factor among many. They can always be accommodated to different social demands. So they're not determining. I mean the scientific principles. What's determining is the totality of conditions that include social needs that are expressed more or less effectively by the actors who are affected by the technology. So, for example, you can operate a factory in such a way that it pollutes the surrounding river and land, or you can operate the factory in such a way that it protects the surrounding rivers and land. Those are both possible. The science doesn't tell you which one to do. What it tells you is the pressures or absence of pressures on the owners to conform with either a market that is seeking the bottom by destroying everything around it, or a public that is intervening through social movements or lawsuits or political regulation to provide itself with a tolerable environment. So in the end, the scientific principles will be adjusted to these conditions. Now, if the public understood that, they would not be fooled by claims that you have to put up with X, you have to do Y. Z is an imperative of technology. What are you, some kind of Luddite, technophobe? You want to go back to nature? That's the ideology, right, which is deployed to resist democratic interventions into technology. I should mention one thing. Of course, it's quite possible for the public to be wrong. I'm not saying that the public is always right. We look at the anti-vaccination movement for an example of how really stupid and dangerous ideas can capture the imagination of large populations. But we notice things like that because they persist in the public eye indefinitely since they're wrong. Whereas the things that are done right just sink down into the new design methods, the design criteria, and then we kind of forget where they came from. Why are there pollution controls on industries today? Why is food relatively safe to eat? I mean, there are social movements in the background, but the movements have ceased to be so active because they've succeeded, at least in the case of food safety. In the case of the environment, there are new issues that come up that overshadow the older ones. So we tend to forget where things came from and just take them for granted. And that makes it seem like the public is really exemplified by the anti-vaccination movement, when in fact, far more important and influential outcomes of democratic interventions shape our environment and our lives in a positive way, in a good way.
Yeah, and you mentioned something, well, you know, the Luddites, but I guess in general, people that are interested in studying technology, maybe, well, both in the academy and in the public, and in post-development theory as well, you see certain people have ideas, or there's certain groups that, yeah, they want to revert back to a certain political structure that's, well, they feel maybe more primitive anarchist, or more in line with the original way that society was structured, but also just disregard technological advances that could otherwise have a benefit for them. But yeah, why do you think it's so attractive to just reject technology when, by and large, the good outnumbers the bad?
You know, Woody Allen made a movie where he goes back in time and he meets all these fascinating people. And finally, he's back in the Belle Époque in Paris in 1900, and sitting at a table with Toulouse-Lautrec. And his girlfriend says she wants to stay there. And he says, but, what about Novocaine? What about penicillin? So, so he goes back to the present while she stays in the Betty Punk. So, um, of course, the people who are put forward the technophobic line, for the most part, are not really consistent because they will take Novocaine when they go to the dentist. Um, but I think there's it's a kind of reaction against an excess, right? An overwhelming excess of devices, of controls, of uh, remote powers, and people react against it by thinking about going back to the land. There was a big deal in the 1960s, going back to the farm, communes, so on. Today, there's still people who talk about it, but I don't know anyone who's tried it. So I don't think this is very significant. I mean, I think what's significant are the effective social movements that drive change and not the spiritual protest against technology as such, which really is impossible to carry through to the limit.
Yeah, do you think so? Just this will be my last question in this line, but do you think there is something towards what they're doing? So perhaps, let's say, technology, I think some people would agree at times gets beyond its necessity. Um, Maybe toothpaste doesn't need to be as advanced as we take toothpaste to be, but every couple years there's some new breakthrough in toothpaste. And in India, I remember reading an essay, and they were saying, well, as soon as we run out of toothpaste because we may not have the money for it, we go back to chewing on sticks and using herbs that, well, virtually have the same effect. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm just interested. Do you see, yeah, there being some significant or some purposeful uh, social activity where this becomes more commonplace for people, sort of a more naturalistic approach?
Well, I guess I'm skeptical.
Okay.
When the environmental movement started to become an important factor in American social life in the 1970s, there were two schools of thought. One school followed the cartoon character Pogo, who said, "We have met the enemy and he is us." The idea was that our behavior was responsible for pollution, and that by changing our behavior as individuals, we would solve the problem. The other school of thought said, no, this is a social problem. It needs to be solved at the level of legislation and regulation of industry. And I think the latter school has won out on the whole. I mean, it's now, in 1970, it was unclear whether that was a feasible way of addressing problems like air pollution. And now we know, yeah, that works, having the government intervene. Um, the lifestyle change idea, I'll take fewer airplanes, I'll eat less meat, so on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's an effective way to address the problem. Um, it's it just, it's such a small factor when you consider the contribution, say, of the oil industry to climate change. What difference does it make how much beef I eat compared to the industrial pollution caused by the oil industry. So I don't know. My inclination is to say, let's focus on the big causes and not wait for the accumulation of a billion tiny causes to somehow add up to a good outcome.
What would some of those big causes be? And then what would you say, is the proactive way to do something about them?
Well, right now, the major environmental issue that we confront now is climate change. And the big causes have to do with the way we produce energy. And to a lesser extent with the way we use the energy we produce. The key is to substitute, wherever possible, renewable energy for fossil fuels. And that's a process which is beginning. There are certain countries like Denmark and Germany that have pushed much further than others. Evidently, the oil industry is less powerful in those countries than in places like the United States, where it seems to completely dominate the government. So if we could focus massive investment in this area, it would make a big difference. And what puzzles me is the impotence of the modern neoliberal capitalist state. Very strange. You know, in the 1950s, the American state decided that people should live in suburbs. And they built the highways and they facilitated mortgages and they did all kinds of things that resulted in the premature destruction, basically, of trillions of dollars worth of downtown real estate in order to move people out to the suburbs. And this was a huge social enterprise. I don't know, I mean, an economist could figure out what it cost, but certainly what we need to do today is probably on such a scale, and yet governments don't do it. And it puzzles me that they seem to be so impotent. The most extreme case, of course, now is the US government facing the COVID-19 crisis without any significant initiatives. No mobilization of industry, nothing. Just watch it unfold. It's unbelievable. So, but this seems to be a general problem of these neoliberal states, that they seem unable to make big decisions, to face major crises. And the climate change crisis is real. It's a big deal. I mean, there are weird things going on, like whole sections of Miami, which is one of the large American cities, have to be pumped out regularly because so much water is flooding in from the rise in the sea level. What's going to happen to New Orleans? I mean, they're large cities. New York City ultimately is in jeopardy. Why isn't this a subject of immediate and urgent action? This is a mystery. We need public pressure, immense public pressure, to change this situation. So what can be done is to engage with the movement, which is mostly a movement of young people, to address climate change.
I wonder if the impotence, as you say, somehow comes from, well, people's faith in technology. So the person who's not directly in the government or not directly a technician of some sort that would deal with this type of problem, it seems to me that there's a bit of a myth running through the public where people think out of nowhere a new technology will emerge or a breakthrough will happen or some giant project will come and all the things we worried about before will cease to exist. What do you think of the validity of that sort of?
Good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. I mean, sure, go to Las Vegas and start playing these slots.
Yeah.
Likely you get rich, but I mean that's silly. Um, we know what needs to be done. There's no technical mystery involved. Of course, technical advances could help. For example, greatly improved battery technology would be an enormous help. But in the end, it's about not using fossil fuels. And that's the part of the system that's most easily altered in order to address the large-scale issue of climate change. And there are many other things, but that's, for example, it would be better if everyone drove a electric car, because we can better control the sources of pollution that generate electricity than the pollution that is generated by millions of internal combustion engines, many of which probably don't really have any pollution controls anymore. So there are many points at which you could intervene, but the single biggest one is the generation of energy. So, and there's not going to be a big technological magic that's going to, fusion power, please, just
Yeah.
when we need it. Let's hope. I mean, it's possible. You could have fusion power someday, but it's already been a long time since we started on this path. It's like 40 years, and we're still nowhere near having fusion power.
One of the things, you talk about is values that people have in regard to technology. So you say values are the facts of the future, and also in another writing, you have, in the end, we get technologies that embody values as well as knowledge, but this is a hidden, unconscious aspect of the technical environment. And how do you see modern values, and if you can name them, either having detrimental or beneficial effects in the future?
Well, first, my proposition that values are the facts of the future is meant to call attention to the way in which what people hope for and want eventually gets embodied in technology. So there is a kind of, I guess you'd call it these days a meme, put forward mostly by business, which says our technologies are the facts, and the things that you're complaining about, pollution, whatever, those are just ideologies. They're values that are without any reality, without any purchase on the real world. Whereas what we've got, these technologies, this is reality. But of course, the technologies themselves were developed under various social pressures, social forces at earlier times. And so those technologies embody values that have now been materialized, crystallized, by being combined with the appropriate technical knowledge. And so the same will happen in the future. So there's nothing special about today's technology. It's going to be modified. It'll be transformed in accordance with what today look like ideologies, but tomorrow will be embodied in the machines themselves. So that's what that proposition is supposed to communicate. The question of what are the current values is a good one, because we can see that a lot of those values are not conducive to solving the problems technology poses for us. If your main concern is to be the Marlboro man, you gotta have your gun. You're out on the range, an independent agent, herding those cattle. I mean, come on. But that seems to be a mentality that's widespread in the United States. Probably less so in France. But there are mentalities that, you know, conflict with an intelligent interaction with the technical world that actually pretty much organizes our whole lives. But among the values that people hold, there is, for example, health. Health is a very important value for people. And when they perceive the technology intruding on their health, they may protest. And there you can see the externalities of industry, for example, causing air pollution, causing asthma in children, and respiratory problems. I mean, then there's a backlash. People don't like this situation. They protest. They write their congressman. Governments see a path to popularity by serving those values. Regulations change the way automobile engines work, and so on. So there's a dynamic there that around the value of health that can lead to beneficial changes in technological design. And another case in point is privacy. What's going on with the internet, where privacy has now been completely abolished. It's quite remarkable. The big internet companies have succeeded, at least for a while anyway. Now they've succeeded in convincing people that they don't need to have any privacy. Total surveillance is acceptable. But you know, how long will people put up with the consequences, namely the complete corruption of the political process by bots and trolls? Not to mention, of course, the intrusive commercialism that is part of this whole scheme. So at some point, perhaps people will again realize that privacy is a value and press for changes in the rights of the companies like Facebook and Google to appropriate their personal information.
Yeah, we haven't spoken about social media yet. Why do you think it's so easy to sort of, I guess, get to such a large institution? So I know, besides the bots on Twitter and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, there's even very funny things, I think, in Kurdistan and other areas of conflict around the world. Facebook has people working on how to protect one group's political page from another group's political page, so no one can see where people are and hackers can't get in. I mean, it's a massive degree of surveillance and even further, political influence. Do you think that there actually is a way to regulate them in total, or will it just be an issue that is regular to the world, somehow?
Every summer, there's a series of conferences in a villa, a chateau called Dagstuhl in Germany, about computing. And I was invited to one about the internet. And so I was surrounded by computer scientists and their students and people from the computer industry. There's like 60 people. And they were all outraged at what the companies have done. I felt like, my father was a physicist, and he was not happy that physics was used to make atom bombs.
Hmm.
His science was not supposed to be put to such a nefarious use. Imagine what Einstein must have thought when he discovered that E equals mc squared would be the formula under which you could calculate the energy released by an atom bomb. Uh, these people were in the same spot. They had their beautiful science, their beautiful technology, which was going to benefit humanity, and is being turned into a monster. And so, at the end, we came up with recommendations that included breaking up these companies and restoring the internet to its original configuration as a system uh, of, of peer networks rather than a centralized network. So the technology is available for completely different configurations. It's very flexible. And certainly it's possible to make it illegal to use people's personal information revealed on social networking and social networking sites. It's illegal to reveal people's medical information. So you could just, and that's all transmitted through computers. So you could make it similarly illegal to release personal information of other types. There's no technical reason why it has to be the way it is. The reason why it is the way it is economic. It has to do with the economics of the advertising industry, and it's completely contingent. It could be changed overnight by new rules, new regulations, new laws. So, and these computer people know that because they invented all this stuff. They know how it works. They know what its possibilities are. And for them, it's obvious that you have to stop what's going on. But the public is, of course, far behind in their understanding of what's happening. So it'll may take a while for the lessons to sink in. Just as with the environment, it took quite a while for people to figure it out and become active in defense of their own health.
I think it's interesting because throughout this talk we've been having, it becomes noticeable that very common sense, simple things are lacking in the general population's knowledge of technology. But on the other side, so that's to say, we take certain things for granted, that social media is going to be prevalent no matter what, and that Silicon Valley will always have some sort of power dynamic with the public that won't go away. But so we take this, but also some of the very, I guess, simple things and that could change the sort of paradigm we're living in are also counteracted by how people have they have knowledge of technology in very attractive ways. And what I mean by that is almost everyone has heard the term a quantum computer and understands basically what a quantum computer might do. Or there might be this idea that in the future you can download your consciousness into a computer and hypothetically live forever. And ultimately, right, it's all based on this idea of singularity, or the intelligence explosion, which let me just explain real quick, is a hypothetical point in the future when some technologies suggest that humans and AI will merge to create what is basically a new step in human evolution. I think it's a talking point everyone has probably had at one moment in their life or another, discussing it, whether in a bar or with a coworker or etc. But what's your impression? And uh, yeah, overall view of it.
Yeah, well, I don't believe in this notion of singularity. I find it totally implausible. Computers manipulate symbols, but they don't have the capacities of the human mind. There are things we do that involve manipulating symbols, and computers can do them better. But there's a lot of other stuff going on in our heads that computers simply can't do, and never. There's no reason to believe that they can do it ever. Um, our relation to the world is organized around meanings. And the one thing that we can be pretty sure computers don't have any handle on is meaning. They can manipulate counters that stand in for meanings, but that's not the same thing. And it doesn't give rise to the kind of creative possibilities that the relation to meaning gives rise to, or the freedom that the relation to meaning makes possible. So this is, from a philosophical point of view, I just think the idea of the singularity is, it's like, why not fire hydrants becoming human? I mean, they do a useful work. They look sort of like little people. It's just, it's just not real. But that doesn't mean that computers won't have artificial intelligence, big effects on our social life and the way we think about ourselves and the things we do and know how to do. That's another matter. But I don't see that as a stage in human evolution. It's a stage in social evolution for sure. But it leaves us humans pretty much what nature made us to be. So that's my attitude toward this proposition. I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount of hype around artificial intelligence, nanotechnology. There's always a lot of hype. Why? Because you've got to have a story in order to get funding. This is all about venture capital. It's all about having a good story that brings in resources. And doesn't have to be a true story. I'm sure the venture capitalists are pretty cynical by now. But if it's a convincing story, it's worth a try. If you've got billions of dollars and need to put it somewhere, in the hope that 1 in 100 investments will double your money. So, but it gets out into the public. It's in Wired magazine, or Ray Kurzweil writes a book about it, and pretty soon everyone is talking about the hype as though it were real. And the next thing you know, a bunch of philosophers are getting really worried that the hype might actually be real and this might be our future. What can we do about it? We need new ethics to deal with. So it becomes a known thing. It's just part of the cultural environment. But that doesn't mean that it's real. It's still just a story someone made up in order to a kind of science fiction thing. So I think a lot of what's going on today around technology has that character.
Yeah, I know that it's not uncommon that people working in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and even some very prominent educators, so Bill Nye the Science Guy, right, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, they say, okay, philosophy is over. There's no need for philosophy anymore. Science has it all, right? And, well, what's interesting about it is that this ends up becoming reflected, I think, in the public, and the public starts to believe that science is the only way to understand knowledge. And so when science finds knowledge inherently fallible, they're not able to recognize absolute truth. It's one of the sentiments you propose, and you then say appearance and reality stand opposed. Can you explain a little bit more about the opposition between appearance and reality in between philosophy and the technological world, if it makes sense?
Well, I think seems like mixing several different things together.
Sorry.
So, on the one hand, I mean, the point about everyone saying that science has the ultimate truth, no scientist believes that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that science is fallible, and that whatever they believe today, sometime in the future, people will find other ways of understanding the world that will be different, perhaps not proving them wrong, but maybe incorporating their ideas into some very different view of how the world works. Or, in fact, just refuting them because it's happened many times in the past. So every scientist believes that he is part of a process. He's not the holder of a sacred doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
That's for the church. That's not for the scientist. And that process is ongoing, and it will never reach an end. So there is no end of science, no final answer. So, now, of course, that doesn't mean that we can ignore what science tells us. It's the best evidence we've got for lots of things. If we want to know what to do in the face of the COVID crisis, ask Dr. Fauci. Don't ask President Trump. He doesn't know anything. Ask the guy who's got the degrees, who studied the problem. Sure, that's our practical relationship to science. But that doesn't mean that science knows everything there is to be known. It knows a lot. But there's, in the case, for example, of the virus, there are so many other things involved besides the scientific information that we can get from a Dr. Fauci. For example, the role of globalization in the crisis, how the world has been transformed by changes in the world economy in the last 100 years. There's no science of that. This is something that historians can tell us about, that economists can give us some ideas for understanding. People who've invented new forms of shipping, containerization, and so on, have something to tell us, but it's not a subject of scientific study. It's a subject of rational consideration, but it's not science. So the idea that science has all the answers is I think, silly. And nobody applies that idea in their personal life. You're always thinking about other sources of knowledge that you possess besides what science can tell you. For example, your personal knowledge about your own children, say, or your friends. You know things about them, you understand things about them that have nothing to do with science. They come from your personal experience and reflections. So I just don't, just silly. But what we need is to find a way of adjusting the relations between science and technology on the one side and our other sources of knowledge and understanding of the world, and connecting them in a fruitful way. And that's what social movements like the environmental movement are attempting to do. They're attempting to take what we know about life and our feelings about what's important, and to interface that with the resources that science and technology give us to manage the natural world.
I think that that's a pretty good note to end on. But I do want to offer, if there was anything that you didn't get to say, or if there was a question I should have asked but didn't, now's the time to put the cap on the bottle.
No, I think we should stop here because I agree. It's a good end, and we could go on forever, but we better not.
Well, once again, thank you very much for being here today. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. It was fun.